welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Harkin in Berkeley, California. I have to say we were going to call this one the silky smoky sounds of the Green and Red podcast with what we're going to be talking about today. But as always, I am joined by...
That's Bob Bazanko. I'm in Houston, Texas, and I want to welcome all of you to the debut of a new Green and Red feature. We're going to start doing what we're currently calling an arts and culture series. If we think of something better than that, we'll change it. But so what we're going to do is, because we do this a lot already, we talk a lot about popular culture and the way things like films and music can have kind of a great political consciousness. So we're going to start doing these features intermittently, where we take a movie, or it could be a play, it could be a book, it could be an album, whatever, and discuss it. We'll talk about what it's about, but also more importantly, to talk about the political meaning of these. And so this is our debut episode. And Scott, do you want to tell the people in your smokiest voice what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah. All right. So today we're going to be talking about Mad Men, one of our favorite series, which is considered one of the golden age of television shows, of the new golden age of television, which include The Sopranos and The Wire and Breaking Bad, which we may do future versions of episodes of this on. But Mad Men started in July 2007 and ran through May 17th, 2015, had 92 episodes. The cast was fairly unknown when Mad Men started, but a number of the actors became well known and started their careers out of Mad Men, including John Hamm, Elizabeth Moss, John Slattery, Christina Hendricks, January Jones, Vincent Kartheiser, and many others. The other thing I'll say about Mad Men is it was produced by the showrunner was Matthew Weiner, who had been a writer on The Sopranos, and had tried to sell this show to many of the networks and finally got it on AMC. And so we'll be talking about Mad Men and all that it entails.
Before we start, I just want to briefly talk about the background or the backdrop or the context of Mad Men, because I think it's somewhat important. It deals with the advertising industry, which I think is really a great way to study the post-war era, both politically and economically. And advertising is really crucial to the advent of American capitalism, especially in the early 20th century. And as a professor, I talk about this too. And I start with Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew. Bernays studied psychology like Freud did, because that's what advertising is, right? It's psychology, getting inside people's heads, convincing them they need something. Bernays worked as a propagandist in World War I, and he worked on the Committee for Public Information that Woodrow Wilson had created to create kind of support for the war and attack people who opposed the war. So today, when Joe Biden talks about critics of the war having a ferocious anti-Semitism, that's straight out of Bernays' playbook. But Bernays, after that, went into the private sector, and especially the cigarette industry, which is why that's important. And Bernays really pioneered, I think, in many ways, modern advertising. When Bernays took over the Lucky Strike account, I forget the number of cigarettes total sold in the United States was somewhere in the tens of millions, just of loose cigarettes, right? By the time Bernays got really into it, 10, 15 years later, it was in the billions. And in the early stages of capitalism, the 20th century, that was a consumer capitalism. In the early stages of capitalism, they're building big stuff. They're building railroads and factories and machines and things like that, which individuals don't purchase, right? It's capital for other capitalists. It's a producer's capitalism. But once that's developed in the early 20th century, late 1800s, and especially in the early 20th century, you start to see the development of a consumer industry, radios and appliances, toasters and washing machines and canned goods, processed foods, things like that. So now you have to reach a bigger market, right? Americans have a little bit more money, but they're certainly not wealthy. So you have to reach a bigger market. And that's where advertising came in. Fast forward to Mad Men, which debuted set in around 1960. And by that time, the advertising industry is really in full bloom. And I think Mad Men does a fantastic job of talking not just about that industry, but about the nature of the post-war economy, post-war growth, post-war liberalism. It has all kinds of ideas and messages stuck in there. So that's what we'll talk about today. Now, since you mentioned the smokiness of it all, that's the debut, the pilot episode. And I think it sets the tone for the series.
Yeah, and I'll say that smoking is an ongoing theme, both smoking, the tobacco industry, the advertising firm, which is the sort of center of Mad Men, which is Sterling Cooper. Smoking and tobacco and cigarettes are an ongoing theme up into the very last episode, which we'll talk about. But the plot of Mad Men's very first episode centers on an impending Surgeon General report that will link smoking tobacco to lung cancer, which is a crisis for the series' protagonist, Don Draper, who's played by John Hamm. In fact, it's not a health crisis, but Don Draper, the head of the creative department at Sterling Cooper, is first introduced smoking a cigarette and sketching out tobacco ad campaigns on the back of a cocktail napkin in preparation for a high-stakes meeting with his largest client, which is Lucky Strikes. He is also talking to a black waiter in the restaurant bar where he is working on this, asking him why he smokes the particular brand of cigarette that he smokes versus Lucky Strike, why he would switch. The waiter tells him it's because it's what they introduced to us in the military. And then also a white waiter comes over and asks if the black waiter is bothering Don. But the cigarette advertising had long emphasized the supposed therapeutic benefits of smoking, and the Lucky Strike wants a plan for how to continue selling a product when the public inevitably finds out that it's deadly. It should also be noted that Bernays, part of his advertising campaign, was also about the therapeutic benefits of cigarette smoking, as well as how it was good for your waistline.
When that episode starts, they have that older woman come in who does all the research, the advertising research. And Don rejects that. Don's old school, right? He started out in this little kind of boutique firm, and he's now with one of the biggest guys on Madison Avenue. But at one point, when this woman is talking, she makes reference to when I was working with Edward in Vienna, and that's Bernays. So they do throw cryptically to him, right? It's interesting, too, because the waiter to whom Don is speaking, who says he got started in the military, I'm not sure that was a Bernays idea, but in World War I, tobacco companies started giving, I think, a carton of free cigarettes every month, maybe, to the soldiers in World War I in the Great War in Europe, right? And so what you do is you give these freebies out. It's like a junkie, right? You give somebody a free hit. And so when these guys came home, they were cigarette smokers, and they started, and the same thing happened in World War II. So it's a huge industry. And it's an industry that traffics in death, right? And that's why the Surgeon General report was important. And the way Don plays with that is essentially, and I think this is important because it says a lot about capitalism, right? The public health aspect of it is not a big deal to them. The market share is. They don't really care if it makes people sick, right? And Don points out, we're all selling the same product. Everybody in the cigarette industry sells the same product, right? So you have to make yours different, right? Everybody is selling essentially cancer. And that's where he comes up with a slogan that had been in use for Lucky Strike forever. He asks them how they make it, right? And the guy's describing how they go through the process of making cigarettes. And at one point, he talks about getting tobacco leaves and toasting them. And Don has that epiphany where he says, it's toasted, which was the long time slogan, right? And it shows just how inherently duplicitous advertising is, right? You're selling people, it's toasted, which sounds good, right? Something toasted is probably good for you. And then you have these ads. Ronald Reagan did ads. So many, 20,679 physicians say, smoking Lucky Strikes is good for your health, that kind of thing. So it's really a great way to start. And it combines these two really things, advertising, which is really crucial to get capitalism moving, which Bernays understood from the early 20th century in order to create a consumer base and convince people it's okay to buy stuff. America had grown up in kind of a more of a Victorian era where, to some degree, it was considered sinful to purchase things you don't need, to be ostentatious, or to have debt. And so now what the advertising industry is doing is flipping all that around and saying, oh no, buy everything you want. It's okay to buy stuff you don't need. It's okay to borrow in order to do that, because the whole purpose of life is to have fun and to enjoy yourself and to have all these. So it's a great way to start the show. And it really, I think, takes off from there.
The one thing I'll say both on Bernays and the sort of the theme of cigarettes and the tobacco industry throughout the show, but applies to like many things in the show, is one, it's a history of modern post-war capitalism. And then two, it shows you how the advertising industry actually manipulated people to think that it was more important to have a relationship with things like refrigerators and toasters and cigarettes than with other human beings. Alienation from other humans, isolation, those are also ongoing themes in Mad Men as well. And not only is it the business of Sterling Cooper and Don Draper to kind of kind of increase that alienation and isolation, but it also plays out in how you see, we're not going to go too much into this today, but it's also like the personal life of Don Draper as well, is how alienated and isolated he is from everyone around him.
But that is important though, right? Because Don, he's very wealthy, he's handsome, he's a serial carouser,
Beautiful family.
beautiful, but he's miserable. He's not a happy guy. He does all kinds of weird shit. There's a lot of weird storylines where he does things that just are inexplicable.
He's an
But again,
alcoholic.
he's an alcoholic, right? So I think that alienation element of it is important. He also, at various times, could do the right thing. Like, I know in a minute we're going to talk about the role of women in this show because that's really important. And Dawn, he's a hound dog, right? He's alley catting around with different women, cheating on his wife and so forth. But at the same time, he actually really becomes a mentor to one of the women there, Peggy. He starts just in the steno pool and then works his way up to becoming this like super ad creator. So it's multifaceted and really interesting. And it does hit on all these stages: smoking, advertising, the kind of alienation of capitalism. And Dawn, even though like on one moment you admire the guy and you want to be him, and on the next moment you think, man, that bastard's miserable.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think says a lot about kind of the and the real nature of capitalism beyond the kind of facade and all, right, what they want you to believe. It brings a lot of like alienation is the perfect word for it.
And then another thing that Bob just referenced is the gender politics of Mad Men, which is women in the workplace. There's very much like storyline after storyline about the sexual conquests and how carousing with the secretaries and the other women in their lives, as well as like prostitutes, is actually very much is okay by the standards of what happens in the New York advertising community. But then there's two very strong women characters on the show, which are Peggy Olson and Joan Harris, played by Christina Hendricks, who both start in the secretary pool or as the office manager and work their way up. And the show very much examines the role of women in the workplace in the 1960s. And Mad Men is considered a slyly feminist show. And Weiner actually was very much influenced, particularly when it came to Peggy, by Betty Friedan's feminine mystique. And then with Joan, Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the City girl, which I believe is also in the pilot as well. And so the role of women is something that's very much important in Mad Men as well. There's a lot of critique that there's less around race politics, but there's very much like it's strong on gender politics.
Yeah. And the dominant theme with regard to gender is, of course, that these men see these women as conquest, or they're there for pleasure.
Objects.
Yeah, objects. And the women themselves, like Joan, when she meets Peggy, is explaining to her how to get a husband. Or there's that frequent thing about you're there to find a husband, and the guys there will get their laundry and do private business for them, take care of their personal affairs and things like that. And then, so that's why the emergence of Peggy, and I think, Joan, and even more Peggy probably. I know when the show was on, especially Peggy finds her way, like season 3 or 4. And the women I knew at the time just loved her. If you talk to people or on social media, there was this sense that Peggy was like a first wave feminist, right? Now, and keep in mind too, this is within a capitalist framework, right? She's not out in the streets. She's not burning her bra or whatever the stereotypes of that era were. She's working clearly and succeeding within a corporate environment. And then Joan, of course, does it too. Now, at the same time, how does Joan become a member of the board of directors? She sleeps with the client, right? And that was part of the deal.
It's how she becomes
a partner. Yeah. Because she's
with the Jaguar guy, who's repulsive sort of guy.
Yeah, yes. And she did that. But at the end of the day, they don't really morally condemn her for that. So it's really interesting thing. But I think I don't study this extensively, but among TV shows I've seen, the way they deal with women is different. Let's say The Sopranos, where the women are secondary kind of supportive characters, right? And occasionally you see Matt will get in Tony's face about being in the mafia, but for the most part, the women are clearly secondary and subordinated in a show like The Sopranos. Whereas I think in Mad Men, they have a much bigger voice, which I think is important because it does speak again to that cultural idea in the 60s of women emerging. In the first women's movement, before women's liberation, the first women's movement is actually pretty corporate. It's dealing with things like supporting JFK, which is a thing, right? It's not an art where Betty and her friends are phone banking for JFK in the 1960 election. So that was the initial women's movement. Was this really liberal, pretty capitalist-oriented movement, and then it becomes something different. And I think Mad Men hits that really well. It really tells a lot about that.
It's also an interesting contrast because in kind of preparation for this show, I watched both the pilot and the finale. And so it's an interesting contrast about that sort of exchange between Peggy and Joan in the beginning that Bob just described. But in the final episode, Peggy's on her way to becoming a creative director of an advertising agency. Joan is starting her own agency and loses a man over her decision to become an independent businesswoman because he doesn't want to deal with it, and she's fine, go. And then she also pitches Peggy on going into partnership with her. And I think that the show takes place from 1960 to 1970. It's an interesting sort of arc of Joan and Peggy through the whole course of the show.
It's also peripherally, as somebody who's old, and I don't remember the era that well, but it really shows just like how intensely America changed in that decade too. That's a fairly significant, right? From 1960, where you have this kind of hope and Kennedy, and it's frivolous, it's kind of devil may care, everybody's drinking at work, everybody's carousing, to 1970, where the characters really they've been through it. They've been ridden hard, and they're showing kind of the weariness. Somebody like Roger who had heart attacks. It's funny, right? They're doing that. They have the cigarette ads, the cigarette accounts, and Roger has a heart attack, right? And they have to the product of his own success, in a sense. But yeah, that stuff is really crucial. And Peggy and Joe really find their voice. But again, it's a feminism clearly within the concepts of this capitalist enterprise, right? They're not trying to make life better for all women. They're trying to get to the top of the corporate ladder or higher up the corporate ladder. So it's more of an individual level of feminism. It's a precursor to the girl boss era, right? Joan is one of the original girl bosses, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And then also there's a sexual liberation element there. Joan sends Peggy to a doctor to get birth control. So it's really kind of nuanced.
There's actually an abortion episode with Joan as well.
Yep. Yeah. Good.
Moving into the next sort of piece that we want to talk about, which is around the politics. And we've touched on some of this already, but Bob and I are both very much fans of the sociologist named C. Wright Mills. And there have been some essays about C. Wright Mills's influence as well on Mad Men, where they talk about the different orders. There's like an economic order, which we see play out a lot with the sort of corporate clients. There's a political order that we see play out, and some of the stuff we're going to talk about next. The one thing I do want to mention is that C. Mills talked a lot about how to join the power elite in post-war America was more through less being like a free market entrepreneur, like a self-made man, and more how the people work their way up through the corporations, which is what we're talking about, where women were doing that in the 1960s. But what we see is this growth of these large bureaucracies. Sterling Price is a little bit of an outlier on that, but eventually they get absorbed by bigger firms and work their way up through corporate advertising. And so I think that's an important theme in Mad Men. We see that with the sort of economic elite in which they deal with. We see that with the sort of political elite, everything from working on the Nixon campaign to Betty's second husband, Betty being Don's first wife, who is
Rockefeller.
Yeah, he works for John Lindsay and Rockefeller. Henry, there's a whole element of that. And there's even the military elite. There's also nods to that as well, whether it's with Don and Roger's service or episode about getting young man out of Vietnam, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But it's a sort of important thing to note about how to be powerful in America post-World War II is how you work your way up to this corporate bureaucracy.
Remember, Don has created an alternate identity. He's not Don Draper, right? He stole an identity from somebody in Korea who was killed. So even there,
from the real Don,
exposes the real Don Draper, right? I forget what his name was, but it really exposes that.
Dick Whitman.
Dick Whitman, right, who has this really horrible background with his white abusive father and all this kind of stuff. And it really shows, I think, the kind of fictitious nature of this new system, right? Where you can become who you want. Remember at that one point, Vince's Kartheiser's character, I forget his name now, it's embarrassing.
Pete Campbell.
Pete Campbell, who really is remarkable, right? When the show starts, Pete's really not a very likable character. By the end, you really almost admire the guy, right? But Pete finds out about Don creating a new identity and is going to snitch on him. And I think it was Bert Cooper, right? Played by Robert Morris, who, when the show started, was the best known person in the entire cast, I think. And Bert just dismisses Pete, and he says, this is how America was made, by these kinds of people who don't play by the rules and they create these alternate realities. And then that's Trump, right? Trump just invents shit. And about that never happened and sells it that way. And I think that's important too, that Don isn't really Don Draper, right? And that brings up a lot of that on. But with regard to the politics you just mentioned, the way the world has changed, this is also talking, think about the global economic system too, right? At one point, the firm that bought Sterling Cooper was from Britain. That's how Lane Price comes to New York and leads to that segment where they break off and they form their own agency. But I think that in that regard, the one that really always got to me was the art with Conrad Hilton. And Don is at a country club or something, and he goes into the bar, no one's there, and he starts talking to this guy, and it's Conrad Hilton. He's really intrigued by Don, and he has him in, and he's considering giving him some business, right? And then Conrad Hilton's theme is I want to have Hilton hotels everywhere, all over the world, even the moon. So Don did an ad campaign based on the idea that Hilton hotels are all these major cities, all these world cities, right? And Hilton isn't happy about it, right? He's actually pissed off, and he yells at Don, "You didn't give me what I wanted. When I said I wanted the moon, I expect the moon." And it shows this kind of rapacious, limitless, boundless nature of capitalist expansion, one that even Don doesn't understand.
I think it's also important to note about Conrad Hilton is that his character is Christian fundamentalist and a rabid anti-communist.
Yeah.
There's lines he has is, "This country is a force for good because we have God, communists don't." And then, but tying in that sort of like Christian anti-communist capitalist approach is that he also says, "It's my purpose in life to bring America to the world, planting a little bit of America around the world," and apparently the moon as well, which is why he doesn't hire Don, because he doesn't have a plan to put Hilton hotels on the moon.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really quite remarkable, right? And again, it speaks to that, like the idea, the dream of capitalism in the 60s, right? It could go anywhere. This is, I think it's earlier in the show series, so presumably JFK is still president. They're still living in that era of Camelot, right? This is before Vietnam has really become an issue. Civil rights is seen in kind of optimistic ways. And that Hilton arc, I think, really, again, in the hotel industry, the tourist industry, which is a big deal, right? Again, so you see it again, right? If you really wanted to do a story of the 20th century economy, it would be about steel, right? Steel is the most important industry in America in that pivotal era, right? The 30s through the 70s or whatever. But if you really want to get a sense of how capitalism works, it's really great to look at things like advertising, tobacco, the tourist industry, hotels, and things like that. And the guys who did this, I know the names of some of the writers because they were fairly well known and they won Emmy Awards and things like that. But I'd really be interested in their backgrounds because I suspect some of these guys probably had a pretty good understanding of like history and politics and philosophy and things like that, because they really were nailing a lot of this. And the Hilton art is fantastic. In fact, I teach at the University of Houston, which has archives from Conrad Hilton. And apparently the Mad Men people actually were here on campus at the beginning of the show, like doing some research on the Hilton arc. They took this seriously and they did their background work. And I think they created something. Most people see this as a soap opera, and it is, right? It's cool. I like that part of it, but it's really way bigger than that as well. And so I think that's important. But as you mentioned, politics comes into this too. And the Kennedy-Nixon race in 1960 is a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's that's also, that's in the first season. There's a couple different things that play there. That's also overlapping with when Don is being exposed by Pete Campbell as having this hidden identity, or he's Dick Whitman. But in the sort of bigger pictures, we see the men of Sterling Cooper discussing the election and the candidates. The older men tend to favor Nixon because of his status as a self-made man. Don, they're watching a campaign film of JFK's campaign and Nixon's campaign, which are very different. JFK's is like energetic and has a really catchy tune, where it's Nixon talking on a stool and is very boring. But Don talks about how when he sees Nixon, he sees himself, while Pete speaks favorably of Kennedy, citing his lack of a hat as a testament to Kennedy's understanding of how to appeal to a younger demographic as well as the older generation. He compares Kennedy to Elvis. The older men immediately dismiss Pete's opinion, but we know that with hindsight that Pete was somewhat spot on while the others were out of touch. There's also a bit in the Nixon versus Kennedy episode where Bert comes back from a hotel watching the election returns and is complaining about how Mayor Daley has stolen the election, and all this sort of stuff and how democracy is lost, but then admits that he's in a smoke-filled hotel room with a bunch of old power holders, power elite, complaining about how they were screwed over by Joe Kennedy and Richard Daley, which is an interesting contrast. It's democracy's not at work in either instance.
And these guys know that they own, right? They're aware that this is their system, that they own it. They're put out by the whole thing. I think in terms of politics too, like the two biggest issues of the 60s are undoubtedly civil rights and Vietnam. And Mad Men took those on as well. But the civil rights, one of the key elements of civil rights, which is something I've been interested in before that, the way I teach, is that Pete especially wanted to start targeting ads to what they always called the Negro market. And in fact, in the 1950s, the Department of Commerce put out like a 30-minute kind of documentary kind of thing on the Negro market and how to reach the Negro market. So the idea here is that even civil rights to them, which was portrayed as like the great moral issue of our time, right? To them, it was an economic issue, right? We can sell more stuff if we target publications and media that serve the Black community, right? And that's a really important part of it. There is some talk of civil rights. The one I remember the best, which I guess was based on a real thing, was there was a civil rights kind of a rally outside on Fifth Avenue, on Anderson Avenue, I'm sorry. And at a different firm, these white guys, these kind of white frat boy types get out, they get these water balloons and they dump them on all of these people, right? These Black protesters. And then Don, I think it was Don's idea to actually say that we're not like that. And they hire a Black woman to be a secretary. So again, it shows again that kind of co-optation as well. We're going to choose one person to have a job here with us to show how liberal and open-minded we are.
We're modernizing. That's another theme in there is how they're modernizing all the
right. And so the bigger issue I think really is how do we get these people to buy stuff? Actually, which goes going back for a minute when we talk about women. The other part about that, so you have Peggy and Joan, but the women are like Dawn's bulwark, right? There are those scenes where there are issues with Sally, the daughter, right? And she takes off and goes to see Dawn at work. And then Betty comes to get her. And when that happens, the women have Dawn's back, right? Joan and Peggy and the PhD and the psychologist, I forget her name. They have Dawn's back. So women really are in many ways the backbone of Dawn as well. Because Dawn, he's a brilliant guy, but he's also just this kind of crazy drunk.
He's a fuck up, actually.
Yeah, he's very much funny. So the women, it's a traditional role, right? Stand by your man. But they also do it, I think, with a level of strength that you didn't see in most shows that depict that era. So you have that, you have civil rights, and then Vietnam, of course, right? Which kind of, you can't talk about the 60s without that. And it's not like a huge issue, but it's there, right? Don's a vet of Korea, fakes his identity. Peggy marries an army doctor, right? Joan, I'm sorry, who gets sent to Vietnam, right? The Vietnam War is the background to all this. Who's the one? Stan, the advertising guy, I forget his last name, talks about an ad he made for LBJ in the election that they refused to use, right? But I think the two biggest references to Vietnam were, and I think you've already mentioned them, right? One was how the kid dodged the draft, and the other one was when Don goes to Dow Chemical to make a pitch. Right? And those are two of, I think, really that stand out, really memorable episodes.
Yeah, and let's dive into the Dow one for a minute, is that Roger and Don go to Dow Chemical to make a pitch for them to switch their advertising to the Sterling Cooper. I think they've become Draper Price.
Draper Price by then, yeah.
Yeah. And he articulates how Dow Chemical shouldn't be happy with their 50% market share, despite its claims. But then they start talking about napalm. And one of the Dow execs goes, "Tell me about napalm." And Roger says, "You mean that stuff those kids outside of your building are screaming about?" And Don says, "Napalm was invented in 1942. The government put it in flamethrowers against the Nazis, impact bombs against the Japanese. It was all over Korea. I was there. And now it's in Vietnam. But the important thing is when our boys are fighting, they need it, and America needs it. Dow makes it, and it works." It makes the hair stand up on your arms.
Doesn't Roger say when they get out, doesn't he say, "You have blood on your mouth"?
Yeah.
Like spitting blood when he did it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and it's this full-throated defense. Again, the nature of capitalism. Yeah, it kills people and it's in the groundwater. You never get rid of it and all that kind of shit, but it works and we make a lot of money off.
To fast forward to 2022, is we see the CEOs of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin bragging on the onset at the right before the war in the Ukraine starts about how they're expecting their market share to go up because of Russia invading Ukraine and escalated tension in the South China Sea and things like that. And I believe we have seen similar things with the Israelis going into Gaza. And so these things don't change. Mad Men captures the essence of what corporate America is about. They don't care what they make money off of, whether it's selling longer lasting light bulbs or whether it's selling napalm.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, here they are taking on the military industrial complex, right? Again, another major political theme of the 60s. I think the Vietnam one, which actually a mutual friend of ours, a good friend of ours, was actually consulting on, Michael Foley, who's been now doing a lot of stuff on music, musicians, but his first book, great book on Vietnam, Resistance to the Vietnam War. Mike talked to him about this, but Don is having an affair with a woman in his apartment building, played by Linda Cardellini, and they have a son who is drafted into Vietnam, and she asks Don for help. And Don, because he's having a fling with her, right, clearly steps in and helps the kid. So we have draft dodging as part of this as well.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know if I have too much to add on. It's obviously the show takes place in the 60s, and Vietnam particularly as it gets later into the show, Vietnam comes up more and more in the show. I do want to say about the sort of commodification, talking about how they were trying to go into Negro markets. They were also they also talk about how they wanted to get into this sort of emerging like youth market, or what was the baby boomer market at the time, making kids these days presentation about a youth market for a new coffee brand. And so they've hired these two more like younger creatives who launch into a sort of like fake beatnik rap about how he got this letter from a friend back in Michigan. He's still in school, man. And it's got this, 60-page rant in it. He reads from it. He could replace power rooted in possession, privilege, or circumstance by power and uniqueness rooted in love, reflectiveness, reason, and creativity, which is obviously, it's not named in the episode, but that's the Port Huron Statement, which was the founding document of the Students for a Democratic Society. And Don says, that's a beautiful sentiment. Does your friend know what you do for a living? And Smitty, the character, replies with a slightly deflated, yeah. There was a real shitty note with it as well.
What's funny, because in the first episode of the first season, Dawn is having an affair with that hippie chick, right? An artsy hippie woman. Yeah. And one of my favorite things there, Dawn's over there and they're having a party, right? And the police raid the building and they say, everybody stay in. And Dawn gets ready to leave. And one of the hippie guys says, look, you can't go out there. And Dawn looks at him. John Hamm's a great actor in that show, right? He says, you can't go out there. I can't. I'm in a suit. I have a nice coat on. I can go anywhere. They're not going to mess with me. They're going to mess with you, right? It was just like, and they were so good at these little ways just to make these big statements in these very little ways.
And another book, which you've done interviews with the author, which we've actually read and talked about quite a bit on this show, which was actually very influential on the show, was The Conquest of Cool by Thomas Frank. And very much when they drop these little things in there, which basically reads to me as like anti-capitalist sentiment, and how they can take anti-capitalist sentiment, this burgeoning youth rebellion moment of the 1960s, and then commodify that to sell coffee or what have you. If we fast forward to the 90s and the 2000s, that they're selling tennis shoes by playing the Beatles Revolution or what have you, that sort of...
The Enron market itself is like the Elvis Presley of corporations, I think.
And this always, there was a period where every time I watched a commercial that had a 60s song in it, I would always take a note of it. There's like car commercials that would have more things. I
have a huge folder of that, because and when I start talking about the 60s, I show the ending of Easy Rider. And then in the 90s and then in the 2010s, ads were made based on that. The first one was a Mercury ad with Dennis Hopper. The second one was a BMW ad with Peter Fonda. And so what they do is they take the ending of Easy Rider, which is desolate, right? It's really dark. And Hopper get killed by these kind of Southern people.
Also one of the most profound film moments of the 1960s.
Really? And then you flip that into, you play Born to Be Wild, because that's like the anthem of the 60s in many ways, right? You play that, and then you have Dennis Hopper in this Ford, in this Mercury Cougar, which is an old man's car. It's like my father's last car, right? And so you take this really desolate, deep scene and you commodify it to selling something. And then Peter Fonda, you go to the next level. I mentioned Bernays at the very beginning, and you mentioned C. Wright Mills. it also, and I can't specify this, but it also seemed like they were at least aware of Gramsci or even Fred Jameson, who recently died, right? This last week, right? So they're aware that there is this kind of bigger body of work on what advertising and what psychology means, right? And part of advertising, it comes straight out of Gramsci, right? You're convincing people that something that really isn't in your interest is part of your inherent soul, right? Your life, right? And so I think they do that really well too. The way you're convincing people to do things that really aren't necessarily great for them, but they feel like emboldened with that, and they defend this capitalism or these ruling class interests or whatever.
It's the Republicans have been running the culture war for the last 40 to 50 years.
It's also telling, and I remember the top gateway, and now I think it's even a bigger deal. Two of the main characters, not the main characters, the kind of peripheral characters, but high on the list there, were named Kinsey and Ginsburg, right? And you would be hard pressed to find cultural figures who were more appropriate, right? That Kinsey, who does all the sex research, and that's such a huge part of this is a post-Kinsey workplace, right? Sterling Cooper, Jacob Price, whatever, right? That's a post-Kinsey workplace. And then Ginsburg, who is just a nerdy guy, but Allen Ginsberg and Ginsburg and Don hate each other, but Ginsburg comes up with good ideas too, right? I think they slyly bring that into it.
And doesn't Ginsburg's character in the end up being committed to an asylum?
Yeah, he does have a breakdown. I forget. He's like itching or thinks there's bugs. I forget what it was. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Which is, I saw the greatest minds of my generation.
Destroyed by madness, right?
Yeah.
Starving, hysterical, naked, walking through the New York streets of dawn, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. And for folks who don't know, we're talking about Allen Ginsberg's famous poem called Howl.
I think those are the specific things. I think, but you mentioned that larger issue of commodification in the final episode, and you can't really talk about this without talking about the final episode, which in many ways, deliberately or not, I don't know, was an homage to Tom Frank.
Right.
So Don has his like a breakdown. I don't know what you could call it. Right? He just takes off. He goes on the road. He's all over the place. He's just doing weird stuff. You have that weird arc in the diner with that waitress, which never really made sense. I never really figured that one out. He's in a bad way, right? And then he goes to this kind of Esalen kind of type place in California, which that's the new aginess. So you're going from that Vietnam era, the civil rights era. Oh, now people are more reflective. They're more inward. And Don ends up at this place.
I want to say this. One of the things that really struck me, mostly because I just recently read this History of the Beats over the summer, and I recently reread a bunch of Allen Ginsberg poetry. But there's very much like a Kerouac beatnik sort of element to what Don does in those last few episodes, where he goes on the road and he just has these random encounters, and he even dresses the part of what in the pictures of Kerouac and Dean Moriarty and
all those guys.
Yeah, in the 1950s. And then he goes to this spot in Northern California to go through this sort of Esalen meditation retreat, that sort of thing. And so there's also a piece that I always like to talk about when I talk about Mad Men, how Don Draper is always, through the whole course of the show, he's looking for some semblance of inner peace. And so finally, the very last scene of Don in the show is that he's like sitting on a cliffside in a yoga class meditating, and he smiles because he's found inner peace. And then it flashes to
arguably the most famous ad of all time.
It's the Coca-Cola, the real thing. I'd like to teach the world to sing. And so I will say that there's a little bit of a foreshadowing in that episode where he calls Peggy, and the last thing that she says to him when they're on the phone is, because they're working this big advertising, she's, "Don, don't you want to work on Coke?" Which is the holy grail of advertising, which they also talk about a lot through the shows, how Coca-Cola is the biggest advertising account you could ever get.
Yeah.
And fast forwards to the famous Coke, one of the all-time famous commercials where a bunch of hippies are standing on the beach singing, "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony." And so Don Draper finds inner peace and uses it to sell Coca-Cola.
And probably becomes the biggest ad man in history at that point, right? He's up there with Bernays. You mentioned On the Road. It's also funny because remember, after Burke died, coincidentally on the night of the moon landing, he got to see a man on the moon, right? Which is a big theme, right? That Burke's really fascinated with that. It represents, I think, in a lot of ways, old capital, right? He's old money, old capital, old Republican, whereas Roger and Don are a little more hip than that, right?
Yeah.
In their personal life. Burke also, he has this fetish about Japanese culture, He makes people take their shoes off and all that kind of stuff. He represents this older vision. I think of him like the first time I saw it, I don't know why, I thought like Henry Cavill, somebody like that. But after Bert died, remember, he appears in like a dream sequence where Dawn is, and Dawn says something about on the road. And what does Bert say? Very dismissively, he said, well, you think I would read that book or something like that? So they make direct reference to it. And remember, in the weeks leading up to the finale, there was a lot of speculation on how the show would end, much like what was for The Sopranos. And there were a lot of people who actually, I don't know if it was leaked or they just guessed, and you and I talked about that. A lot of people were suggesting that they would use that Coke ad in the finale, right? Because it really made sense. And there were articles in the New York Times and Washington Post referencing Tom Frank and the Conquest of Cool. So it really does. I think I think it's a brilliant show. I think it's a brilliant show.
There's another thing about the finale too, is that the Sopranos, which ended right when Mad Men was starting, and Matthew Weiner worked on both. He was the showrunner for Mad Men. There's a cut to black sort of finale with the Sopranos. There's a lot of people who say that's a similar ending for Mad Men as well. I feel like it's a little bit more of an explainer of what happened to Don Max, personally.
It is. But it also takes you away, in both cases, from character. So the ending isn't about Don, it's about Coke. The ending isn't about Tony and his family, it's about fading to black, right? And I happen to think, I think Chase just wanted to end the show. He whacked the show or whatever. I don't.
Exactly.
The whole kind of Tony was killed. I don't buy that.
Right.
But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, Mad Men is just brilliant. As I was watching it, like a lot of shows, it reminds me actually of Miami Vice. Because when I first started watching Miami Vice, I did it for the vision. It'd be beautiful. Visually, the image be beautiful in Miami Vice. Then you watch it a little more, Mad Men or Miami Vice, and you start to see the political ideas come out. Mm-hmm. And then once you start looking for that, it's heavy. And so if you're going to study like post-war American culture, capitalist culture, it really does a great job of that. Quite often, there's a lot of garbage out there, right? When done correctly, it's a lot easier to watch Mad Men than read a book, right? So a lot of people, I think, got that. Now, I don't know if they, accepted it that way, if they digested it that way, but it was clearly, all those images were there.
I also think it's important that there's a lot of where people say TV is mindless and frivolous or what have you. And I agree with that about a lot of television. But I think that some of the shows and stories that are told actually do build this political consciousness. I think Mad Men is obviously like at the top of the pyramid that does that with a number of other shows that we'll probably talk about in the future. But I think that the political consciousness that has developed in the last couple of decades, this show runs through some of these important political moments and social moments in our history. Mad Men came out not long before the economic crash. It was running during Occupy Wall Street. It was right before the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren became very popular with youth. This show, I feel like the consciousness built around some of what we've talked about today actually feeds into that with it, at least with an intellectual core out there.
Yeah. And then he's got that era too, celebrated kind of the anti-era, right? Tony Soprano, Walter White, later be Saul Goodman, Homer Simpson. Homer's goofy, right? And then of course, like Don Draper, right? So it really does celebrate these guys they're the bad boys who play by their own rules in a way. But it's also, I think, a harsh critique of American society. The Sopranos, I think, is about like the end of the American dream. In the very first episode, when Tony is talking to Melfi, he says, I got in at the tail end. It used to be a good thing. And I think Dawn, the last season, they all they're worn out by the last season of Mad Men. That the 60s has gotten to them. It's taken its toll. Toward the end, they go out to California because California is the new world, right? There's that thing in the New York versus California in the 60s. And people start to see California as the kind of the hope for the future, the sunshine and everything else. New York is old and it's polluted and there's crime and all that kind of stuff. So it deals with just everything that comes up. Is really well done.
And there's because we interviewed Richard Slotkin, the renewal in the myth of the frontier sort of thing, as far as like California goes.
Yeah, absolutely. We have talked about this a ton. Those are some of the key points. I think this is fun. We will, like I said, we're going to do this hopefully on a fairly regular basis. There's a lot of other shows that were essentially like The Americans, which I think was a great show. Music, art, painters, dancers, whatever. Anything is fair game for this.
So, yeah, we've got a couple already in the works. One film, which I won't share yet, and probably some musical stuff as well.
Yeah.
But tune in to the next arts and culture segment, and You can email us at green and red podcast or greenredpodcast@gmail and get a hat, which if you're listening to this, you can't see it, but Bob's wearing one of our lovely trucker hats and we still have plenty in stock. Just email us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com. But also, if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on the audio platforms, give us a rate and review. And then if you really want to help us out, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or become a donor at greenandredpodcast.org by hitting that support button or becoming a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And until then, keep away from the cigarettes, kid, and go out and make trouble and misbehave.